All right, well, we have a lot to cover today, so we're going to jump right in. Good morning and welcome to ARCCA's learning session on SB-379 implementation. This webinar is organized by the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation, or ARCCA. My name is Julia Kim. I'm a project manager at the Local Government Commission. I serve as the coordinator for ARCCA, and I'll also be your moderator for this webinar. A quick overview of today's agenda. I will first provide a brief intro to ARCCA for those who may not be familiar with us, then to our feature presentations. We're excited to have Michael McCormick from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research here with us today to provide an overview of the requirements and timeline of SB-379, which requires local jurisdictions to provide to address climate adaptation and resiliency strategies and the safety element of their general plans. We'll also be hearing from Yoon Kim from 427, a consulting firm working with local jurisdictions on early compliance to SB-379 on their work with the cities of Alameda County. And following these presentations and Q&A with the audience, today's presenters, along with Scheuer from LGC and Untitled from OPR, will also highlight additional resources available for California local governments. A few logistical items to go over. Everyone will be muted except for our panelists, and due to the large number of participants, we ask that you type your questions into the question box. And please feel free to submit your questions at any point during the webinar. I'll be summarizing those questions during the Q&A portions, which will follow each presentation. And broader questions applicable to all speakers may be saved for our final round of Q&A after the overview of resources. Any of the questions that we don't get to, we'll ask our presenters to respond after the webinar, and we'll share their responses in a follow-up email. Also, this webinar will be recorded and made available on our website along with the PowerPoint presentations. So as I mentioned, this webinar is being organized by the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation, or ARCCA, which is a network of leading regional collaboratives from across California that work together to advance adaptation statewide and increase local capacity to build community resilience. As you can see, our current membership of regional collaboratives cover the Sierra Nevada region, the Sacramento Capital region, the San Francisco Bay Area, the Los Angeles region, and the San Diego region. The grayed area, as you can see, that is the Central Coast Collaborative that is currently forming, and we're hoping that they'll be joining ARCCA in the coming months. We're also working to engage North Coast Resource Partnership, as well as stakeholders in the San Joaquin Valley, Inland Empire, and Orange County. Just to mention, the Local Government Commission serves as the coordinator, and the Governor's Office of Planning and Research is an ex officio member of the Executive Committee, and they serve as a critical channel between key state agencies and local and regional entities. And we also have a number of affiliate members, 427 being one of them. In terms of what ARCCA does, we're working to create a strong peer-to-peer network of adaptation practitioners and to formalize mechanisms to exchange knowledge and tools. As I previously mentioned, we also support emerging regional collaboratives by providing targeted guidance and resources. And as we have grown and evolved throughout the years, we're focusing our attention on bridging the planning and implementation gap and strengthening the urban-rural connection, as well as on equitable adaptation practices. And if you have any questions or are interested in joining ARCCA, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My contact information will be shared at the end. And now on to our feature presentations. First up is Michael McCormick. Michael was appointed by Governor Brown in June 2011 as a senior planner in the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. He is leading a number of efforts to implement the governor's goals around land use, climate change, and organizational change, including as part of the team on the general plan guidelines. Michael is also the lead on implementing SB-379. We'll also hear from Yoon Kim from 427. Dr. Kim is an adaptation expert with extensive experience supporting the integration of climate change into planning and decision-making in California, other U.S. regions, and developing countries. She works with local and state governments to understand and mainstream climate change risks and identify adaptation options to build resilience. So as I mentioned, we'll have a couple panelists joining us later on in the webinar. Yoon will also be chiming in during the first presentation with Michael. Nuantara is a resilience program manager with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, where she works on the newly created Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program. Nuantara has a background in urban and regional planning and policy with a focus on social equity and climate change. Finally, Kif Scheuer will also be joining us to highlight additional resources. And Kif is the Climate Change Program Director at the Local Government Commission. Kif is a solutions-oriented sustainability professional with a strong history of engaging diverse audiences in real-world climate protection efforts through innovative, market-focused research and analysis, creative program design, effective project implementation, and compelling public advocacy and education. Just a quick reminder to all participants to please type your questions into the control panel at any point. I'll be summarizing those questions and sharing that verbally with our panelists to respond. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Michael.
Great, thank you, Julia. So I really appreciate ARCCA's invitation for the Governor's Office of Planning and Research to participate in this webinar. SB-379 is a really critical piece of legislation that bridges the state's goals and priorities on climate change with the work local governments have been doing on climate for some time, and really helps to provide some structure behind how that work takes place. What I'm going to do is start with a little bit of a background I noticed there's a number of people that are on the call that aren't from California or may not have direct background in some of the climate change programs that we have in California. So I'm going to do a brief background on that and then dive into the new requirements in the general plan guidelines. So we as the Office of Planning and Research serve a couple of functions for the state of California. One being is we're the state statutory planning agency. So we're really the lead on state land use policy in the state for state agencies. We also manage the California Environmental Quality Act guidelines and help support the updates to those along with the Natural Resources Agency. And we also manage the general plan guidelines, which I'll go through a little bit more in detail in a few minutes. We're the leads on the Environmental Goals and Policy Report, which is a report by the Governor on goals and policies to support environmental issues that cross the spectrum of land use, local, regional, and state actions, of which there's a draft on the OPR website. We also support technical advisories when new legislation is passed or critical issues to local and regional interests are needing to be addressed, and there needs to be consensus within the industry on how to address those issues. The Office of Planning and Research steps in to help support creating consistencies, and we have technical advisories on transportation, electric vehicles, solar energy siting, military land use compatibility, and a number of other issues. The state of California operates our climate programs and policies under 6 goals or pillars established by Executive Order B-3015 back in 2015. So one is increasing renewable energy production to 50%, reducing petroleum use by 50% in vehicles, doubling energy efficiency savings at existing buildings, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from natural and working lands, reducing short-lived climate pollutants, and safeguarding California. And that 6th item is really where we're going to focus our discussions today, as SB-379 folds directly into those priorities around safeguarding California and looking to the future of California and where we want to go as a state. I'm not going to go through all of these. There's a number of different climate change executive orders and legislation that's been passed recently that has really shifted the scope and focus of climate change from just really a state goal and priority to really a state, regional, and local priority that everybody needs to be working on concurrently. And Nuantara is going to talk a little bit more about SB 246 and the role of the Integrated Climate Adaptation Resiliency Program, but we're really trying now with new legislation to create linkages between what's happening at the state and the regional and the local level. Just for a little bit of history, in 2005, the first executive order was passed on climate change, creating targets for 2020 and 2050. So by 2020, getting down to 1990 levels, which we're on track to achieve, and by 2050 being 80% below 1990 emissions levels, which is a little bit longer stretch, and we certainly have some more work to do to get there. but continuing to focus on our emissions reductions will help us achieve those longer-term targets, particularly if we're all working together. In 2008, the first executive order was passed on climate adaptation as well, establishing adaptation as a priority for the state. And then in 2015, Governor Brown signed the Executive Order B-3015, which really looks at integrating climate adaptation and emissions as a priority for the state. So it established the technical advisory group to identify how to do this. And then one of the big items that came out of it was identifying climate change as a priority that needs to be addressed in all planning and investment by the state. And if you work in finance or you understand how grant programs work and pass-through funding work, you know that that's a really significant goal that's been put forward by the executive order, and one that we're continuing to work on implementing incrementally across the state. Programs are starting to incorporate climate change into everything that we do. Vibrant communities and the California Environmental Quality Act updates are also aspects to what's been happening over the past few years. CEQA in particular, this summer we'll have a series of updates to CEQA that address greenhouse gas emissions, but also a response to a Supreme Court case with the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which identified impacts on a project as something that needs to be considered, including long-term impacts such as climate change. So there will be more information coming out of that later in the summer, and we'll be providing webinars to provide information there as well. So I'm going to dive into the general plan guidelines update. Really briefly, a quick update on what a general plan is. It's really the blueprint for how a community grows in California. In other parts of the country, it's similar to a comprehensive plan with a little bit of a difference, particularly as it links to implementation and the California Environmental Quality Act process. It starts with a community vision, allows us to look backwards, but also look to current data and emerging data trends and consider future issues, challenges, and goals. The last general plan guidelines update was in 2003. And for context, at that point, the first executive order on climate change in California hadn't passed. And there's not a single mention of climate change in those 2003 guidelines. So we've really significantly shifted some of the focus in those guidelines to respond to the series of legislation that's moved forward. And climate change is a goal in the state. So you'll look to every chapter in the general plan guidelines and see references to climate change and how to obtain additional guidance and resources to support the analysis of climate change in those individual sections. And one of the more critical pieces of the general plan guidelines is setting goals, objectives, and policies in each element that have to actually be implemented. A general plan is law, so if there's policies in the general plan that are required to be implemented, if they're not, then that is not consistent with the law. So why update the guidelines? Well, I briefly mentioned this, that climate change wasn't addressed, but there's also a number of other issues that have emerged in the past 15, 14 years that needed to be addressed as well, including SB-1000, requiring environmental justice be addressed in general plans, SB-379, which I'll talk about in a second, SB-375, which is Sustainable Community Strategies. It's a regional targets and goals for reducing emissions at the regional scale. Senate Bill 5 dealing with flood management, vehicle miles traveled standards in CEQA documents, island and fridge communities discussions and incentives, tribal consultation requirements that have shifted, and in addition to incentives to connect your local hazard mitigation plans with general plans, which is also something that we've more tightly tied into the SB-379 climate change discussions and the safety element. The vision for the general plan guidelines update includes a suite of tools, not just a document itself, but a living document on the web with hyperlinks and connections to external resources that will be continually updated as time moves forward, so the document does not become stale over time. At least that's the goal. The intent now with a more living document is to update it on a regular basis, perhaps every 2 years or so, knowing that when this document comes out in the next month or so, we're going to be looking at an update probably within a year to address gaps and issues that have come up as people start to implement it. We acknowledge full well that there will be things that people identify as they're starting to implement it because it is a complete rewrite of the document. We also have a general plan data tool that we've created as a part of the guidelines document that will be finalized in time for the final release of the guidelines. And this data tool provides the basic data layers that are needed to develop each of the required elements. It also provides data that we're recommending folks use as context, but isn't required by those individual elements. And that'll be updated over time. We're working with some folks to really build out the geospatial capabilities of that tool and interlink tools as well. And in addition to an updated website and interlinkages with other resources such as the Adaptation Clearinghouse, which was established by SB-246, which Nuntar is going to talk about in a few minutes. So there's 7 required general plan elements, and now an 8th with the environmental justice element. So if you are in a disadvantaged community and required to do an environmental justice element, you also need to do an air quality assessment. Historically, that's only been required in the San Joaquin Valley, and in many other jurisdictions, they've chosen to do an optional air quality element. But if in an environmental justice community that's a disadvantaged community, you'll need to do an air quality analysis as well. And this does link into the climate change impacts discussion. As many folks know, the air quality can be impacted by extreme weather events, extreme heat, and the different ways air can flow as a result of the changing climate. And so those types of things will need to be analyzed as a part of a general plan. There's new chapters on public engagement, healthy communities, climate change, economic development, and social equity and community resilience. For the climate change chapter, it mainly focuses on the greenhouse gas emissions side of the equation. As we did workshops and outreach, we found that a number of people needed additional guidance on how to do a CEQA compliant climate action plan or greenhouse gas reduction plan that works well with the general plan. So in general plans themselves, greenhouse gas emissions aren't explicitly required to be addressed, but what we found is that most communities are addressing them in general plans anyway, because it makes sense and it connects the dots better back to the CEQA analysis and any climate action plan that might be out there. So there's guidance there. And the climate change adaptation analysis is folded into the safety element, but it's also referenced throughout the general plan guidelines. So really briefly on the environmental justice side, we'll be doing specific workshops and outreach on a number of different subject areas within the general plan guidelines, and doing workshops and webinars on the entire general plan guidelines as well. So if you haven't, I'll just take this moment to ask you to sign up for our email lists at the opr.ca.gov, our website. Email lists are in the top right-hand corner, and you can sign up for a couple of different email lists. Please do sign up for the general plan email list, and we'll get you the information you need to sign up for those webinars when they get released. So SB 1000 requires environmental justice be addressed in general plans through either a standalone element or integrated throughout the document. It requires a certain amount of community engagement, and in environmental justice communities, as mentioned, the air quality analysis must be completed. There is a strong link with climate change adaptation, in that what we're seeing is that in those communities that are facing impacts of climate change, underserved or disadvantaged communities tend to feel the brunt of the impacts and don't have the resources to address those impacts as effectively as higher wealth communities and communities that have stronger infrastructure and community networks to support that work. So in a safety element, there's some specific statutory requirements that need to be addressed in the safety element, including climate change, such as flood, fire, earthquakes, liquefaction, and a number of others. In addition to AB 2140, which encourages incorporation of local hazard mitigation plans into the safety element. And this is one thing that SB-379 highlights, is that if you're going to be doing a climate change analysis for your local hazard mitigation plan or for your safety element of your general plan, you really should be looking to use the same analysis in both documents. It creates consistency. It's certainly lower cost for the jurisdiction because you're only having to do the analysis once. And the OES, Office of Emergency Services, is working with us at OPR to make sure that some of those guidelines for incorporating climate change are consistent across both organizations, so that as you're doing the LHMP and you're doing the safety element, you're not having inconsistencies pop up on how to address climate change in those documents. So that's going to be an ongoing discussion. We're also going to be doing joint workshops with OES on how to better incorporate climate change into both of those documents. And one note on the timeline for when you have to do the safety element update to address climate change, the first update is required after January 1, 2017. So we're already past that first due date. Assuming you have an LHMP, the next time you update your LHMP after 2017, you do need to incorporate climate into your safety element. And for those communities that do not have a local hazard mitigation plan, you have to address climate change in your safety element by January 1, 2022. So there's a couple of specific things in the safety element, including that it does not preclude incorporation into other areas of your general plan. We're actually really encouraging folks to include climate change adaptation and vulnerability discussions in other parts of your general plan. It just makes sense, provides context for long-term planning. We don't see climate change adaptation as something that's unique, that should be addressed on the side. It really should be incorporated into everything that we do and everything that's being done at the policy scale when we're thinking about the future. It does encourage cross-linkages and co-benefits, and obviously working on projects that have both the co-benefits of emissions reductions and adaptations will reduce the cost longer term, because you'll be dealing with both of those issues in one policy. Some distinct actions that need to be taken to incorporate adaptation in your safety element. The big one, I think, is reviewing your existing plans and doing a gap analysis of what is currently missing from those plans. Many communities around California have adaptation already addressed in one way or another in their climate action plans, adaptation plans, or general plans. And so taking a look back at the work you've already done to incorporate adaptation. And in some cases, adaptation could be called something else, like addressing additional variability in water supply, or addressing urban heat island effect. It may not be explicitly called out as adaptation. So we would encourage folks to do a deep dive in their current policy documents, identify those gaps, and then create a plan to fill those gaps using an adaptation plan or your general plan safety element. You then want to assess your community vulnerability and critical facilities, and then develop a set of goals, policies, objectives to implement policies that address those vulnerabilities. And I think I put feasible in, I highlighted feasible because oftentimes implementation measures can be created in a way that makes them difficult to implement. Adaptation is something that really requires coordination with your neighboring jurisdictions and at the regional scale. And so we encourage you to work together with neighboring jurisdictions. Adaptation is not something that a local government can fix on its own, and we do need to be working together. And it's one of the reasons why we're developing resources and support at the state level to help our local partners, because we know this is going to be a group exercise in achieving our long-term goals. So the process in brief is basically to follow the 9-step process in the Adaptation Planning Guide, and we'll be updating the Adaptation Planning Guide to respond to SB-379 requirements. Right now, it was published in 2012 before 379 started going through its process, so it doesn't currently include some of the context that's needed to accommodate 379. So what we'd encourage you to do is go through the 9-step process while at the same time cross-referencing with the statute and the guidance in the general plan guidelines. We've tried to do our best to include additional guidance in the general plan guidelines to support you as you go through this 9-step process. But we also encourage you to be creative, think outside the box, use local resources, create some partnerships to leverage some of these steps more effectively, perhaps staff share, cost share, joint procurement opportunities. We are encouraging folks to think outside the statute, and we are looking for best practices and people that are doing innovative things to highlight on the OPR website. One of the critical aspects of that 9-step process is CalAdapt, so cal-adapt.org. It was launched in response to the executive order in 2008 that established adaptation as a priority for the state, and it provides visualizations of climate impacts in California. There's other resources as well, which we're going to actually talk about on a later slide. But this is really the starting point for your adaptation analysis. And if you're looking to provide some information for decision makers on how to go through an adaptation analysis process, or some base visualizations on impacts to your community, I would encourage you to look here, find the impacts that affect your community, and take that data to present in a geospatial format to your decision makers. It really is a convincing resource when people can see what the impacts are that are coming. And it's explicitly called out in the legislation as a vulnerability assessment resource. So I'll leave it there for the presentation. We do have some next steps for the general plan guidelines. We're expecting a release in April of 2017, and then leading up some significant workshops and webinar outreach efforts. We also want to work with people that are doing early adoption of 379 requirements, particularly right now, as we know it's difficult because our guidance hasn't been released yet. People that are trying to comply with the statute, give us a call, let us know what you're doing, and we'll help where we can. We're also looking for pilots of people that have actually gone through the process and think their work complies with 379, and we can work with you to write up a case study on that. We'll continue to improve the tool and the website, and again, support the case study development and technical assistance. So I'm going to hand it off to Yoon now, who's the Resilience Program Manager at OPR, to talk a little bit more about what the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program does.
Great. This is Yoon, as Michael mentioned, here at the Office of Planning and Research. And I'm going to just give a quick high-level overview of the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program that was established through Senate Bill 246 in 2015. So we've just launched the ICARP program just this year, and really the goal or the purpose of the program is to really coordinate our state, local, and regional activities on climate adaptation and resiliency with a special eye towards local implementation. And now we understand, the important connection there between planning and really looking to support SB-379 implementation, and the importance of having strong plans to guide and inform implementation on the ground. But really, we're very excited for this opportunity to really move our adaptation and resiliency work across the state to the next level, really focusing on local implementation activities. There are a couple of cross-cutting objectives that are called out in the legislation in SB 246 that are informing our program. The first that I'll mention is the need to advance equity and environmental justice within the context of our adaptation and resiliency work. As Michael mentioned earlier, with the passage of SB 1000 and then a number of other legislative guidance that has been passed over the last couple of years, really making sure that our adaptation work is supporting those directives and really looking to build local capacity and reducing inequities in our communities across the state. The second cross-cutting objective is moving towards a more integrated approach to climate change. So that's the integrated in the program title name. And we're really looking to find synergies and move to better understanding how we can, through our mitigation and adaptation work, really support those two components as one piece of an integrated approach to climate change. So in terms of the program itself, there are two key elements. The first is that I'll go over is a technical advisory council. We actually just had our first kickoff meeting of the council on Monday of this week, so the 27th. The council includes representation across a broad suite of different sectors and area expertise that was called out in the legislation. And we've also really worked to try to have representation across the state, including both northern and southern, and inland and coastal, urban and rural. So really trying to balance the diversity of communities and localized impacts across the state within a climate adaptation context. The advisory council will be meeting quarterly and really is intended to help guide the program. And really, one piece that we're excited about is the opportunity, because the council is, the meetings are public, is that it really provides an opportunity for a dialogue around how we do coordinate our efforts between state and local jurisdictions to really move adaptation implementation forward. The second component of the program is the Adaptation Clearinghouse, which Michael mentioned a couple times. We really see the clearinghouse as an opportunity to support a community of practice around adaptation and resiliency across the state, and also beyond, in terms of providing resources for people around science and research. So linking to CalAdapt, which Michael mentioned, which provides downscale data and projections, but also wanting to bring in local resources in research and data as we can. The second piece is around guidance and decision support tools. So again, connecting to the adaptation planning guide that Michael mentioned and other guidance, and really connecting there around the general plan guideline guidance and other decision support tools related there. We're also excited to be pulling together a series of case studies that are really highlighting what local implementation is looking like on the ground today, where communities are finding innovative solutions and responses, and also, where are people running into challenges. The goal really being to, again, support a community of practice to move this work forward. And then lastly, providing resources and information around funding and financing. We know that that is a barrier in terms of moving forward. So on local implementation. So really wanting to provide resources as we can. The last thing I will mention before I hand it over is that as we're developing the Adaptation Clearinghouse, we are going to be holding a series of workshops with potential user groups to really get a better understanding and a better sense of what type of information and resources are of most value to really support local implementation. So if anybody is interested in participating or finding out more about those workshops, or would like to help us better understand what are the needs around the resources we can put into the clearinghouse, please you can either contact me directly or definitely sign up for our email list. As Michael mentioned, on our website, you can sign up for a number of email lists, including the ICARP distribution list. So I'll stop there and hand it over.
Great. Thank you so much, Yoon and Tara and Michael. We have a ton of questions, and I really appreciate everyone's engagement. We only have time to get to a couple, but we will make sure that we get responses to share as follow-up. So just a couple key questions. Michael, if you could expand a little bit more about the timeline. There was a bit of confusion with the January 1st, 2017 date that's written in SB-379. So for example, if the local hazard mitigation plan is adopted on or after January 1st, 2017, is the complete safety element already due?
That is, so upon the next revision of the local hazard mitigation plan, so we would say if your LHMP was in process, the LHMPs oftentimes have a very lengthy update process associated with them. There isn't a clear indication of what the legislation meant by upon the next revision of. At this point, we're providing guidance that if you've submitted the LHMP for consideration to OES, then that certainly does not apply by January 1. But if you are still in the process of updating your LHMP prior to submitting that initial draft to OES for review, then that's something that you need to be looking at the safety element for an update cycle. Hope that answers that question.
Great.
And actually, that does bring up a point that we should probably include that narrative in the general plan guidelines. So thank you for bringing that up.
Wonderful. Let's see. Plans to update the adaptation planning guide, and is there a time frame for completion?
We are actually looking at the update cycle right now and trying to identify what needs to be updated. It'd be good to hear from folks who've been using the adaptation planning guide, particularly in context to SB-379, about what you think needs to be updated. I think this is going to be part of some of the outreach we do early on after the general plan guidelines are released to elicit that type of information. And Yoon and the OPR team that's supporting the Adaptation Clearinghouse is also going to be working with the Natural Resources Agency and the Office of Emergency Services, which is the lead on the Adaptation Planning Guide, to highlight some of these changes that are needed. OES is actually the lead. What they're doing is in concurrent with the State Hazard Mitigation Plan update process, which is ongoing right now. They're also scoping the update to the Adaptation Planning Guide. So we could expect the update to start later this year and hope for a revision to the Adaptation Planning Guide in 2018.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael and Nuntara. And again, to all of our participants, I'm sorry that we can't get to all of your questions. We'll be sharing everyone's contact information at the end of the webinar, so I encourage folks to reach out to our presenters directly. And we'll also be, again, compiling all of the questions that have not yet been answered, and we'll share the responses afterwards. And now over to you, Yoon.
Sorry, I was on mute. Okay. Thank you, Julia. And thank you for the opportunity to present here. And also thanks to Michael and Nuntara for that very helpful overview of what's happening in California at the state level. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an example from Alameda County where we're working with 7 jurisdictions to help them integrate climate considerations into their local plans. And so I'll talk a little bit about who we are and then provide some overview and context on the project, and then dive into a little more detail about the climate hazard assessment approach that we took, as well as our approach to developing the adaptation measures. And then just highlight one example of how a city is using the results of this particular analysis. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with 427, we are a climate resilience research and advisory company that's based in the Bay Area. And our focus is really on bringing climate intelligence into policy and economic decisions at different levels. We're based in Berkeley, and we were founded in 2012. We work across sectors, and so we do work with both the public and the private sectors, as well as with different international organizations. Oops, sorry, it's advancing. Okay, and so in terms of what we offer, at the local government level, we work with local governments to help them better understand what climate risks they face and what that means for the things that they care about. So how does it affect their communities and their resources? And then work with them to develop localized adaptation strategies that help them better engage with their communities, as well as develop actions that help them to safeguard their priorities. We also do some work with the corporate and the financial sectors, and so have products and services targeted to business climate analytics, where we help monetize impacts on operations and supply chains, do cost-benefit analysis work of risk management responses, particularly in the context of uncertainty, and then help our clients identify new opportunities. Are there markets or strategic reallocation opportunities that would be helpful to them? On the financial climate analytics side, we do things like portfolio risk screening, and then developing risk ratings to help our clients better understand what changing climate conditions means for their investments, and then economic analysis of climate-related events that might affect things like pricing. So that's just some background on us, and I'll now switch to looking at the work that we did in Alameda County. And so to provide some background and context, this project was funded by Stop Waste, which is the Alameda County Waste Authority. And we're currently working with 7 cities in the county, Albany, Emeryville, Fremont, Hayward, Livermore, Piedmont, and San Leandro. And our partners are Visonomy and Cadmus. And we were tasked at the beginning of the project with providing 2 types of deliverables. The first is a climate change chapter for each of the cities. And each of the chapters has a climate hazard assessment, as well as a set of adaptation measures. And then we were also asked to develop a template climate change chapter that cities that were not working with us could potentially use as a reference as they think about how they walk through this process of hazard assessment and adaptation planning. So for those of you who aren't in California, Alameda County is one of the 9 Bay Area counties. There are 14 cities, and we are working with 7 of the 14 in this project. In terms of the overall objectives of the project, we have been working with the cities to help them respond initially to relevant state legislation, so legislation like SB-379, which Michael spoke about in more detail, but then also helping them think about federal and FEMA guidance, for instance, how best to respond to those requirements as well. And then a number of the cities that we're working with also have voluntary commitments related to, for instance, the Global Covenant of Mayors. And so we're very cognizant of trying to help the different cities that we're working with respond to these different requirements simultaneously. Another objective was, as Michael noted, it's important for cities ideally to be able to link the different climate change components of relevant planning processes. And so we really hoped that this process would help them better link the climate hazard components, for instance, of their local hazard mitigation plan, their climate action plan, and their safety elements. We leveraged existing resources and approaches like the state's adaptation planning guide. And we also sought to promote a more consistent approach to integrating climate hazards at the county level. And this is something that Stop Waste should really be credited for in terms of having this overall vision of promoting a more consistent approach across the county that they work in. In terms of city context, the different cities set out anticipating using the climate change chapter somewhat differently based on where they were in each of their planning processes. And so Emeryville and Fremont noted that they would use this chapter to inform their climate action plan. Albany, Livermore, Piedmont, and San Leandro were in earlier phases of their local hazard mitigation plan, and so this work could potentially directly inform their LHMP. And then Hayward had recently gone through both of these processes, and so they anticipated actually using this information to inform their shoreline realignment plan. And in terms of who our counterparts were at each of the cities, this just gives you a sense of who we worked with. In many cases, it was the sustainability coordinator, but in some cases, we also worked with people from the planning department. There were a number of Civic Spark fellows that were quite instrumental in the development of some of the city plans. And so we really had the opportunity to interact with different agencies of different cities. Now, to provide a little bit more detail on the process of the climate hazard assessment. So we started off making sure we understood what city goals and the status of each of their planning processes was to give us a sense of where it was most appropriate for us to try and provide information that could help inform directly a given process. And so we worked first to obtain the relevant data. Climate data, I'll talk a little bit more about as I provide more detail on each of the climate hazards we addressed. And then we also incorporated a number of city asset layers. And so our partner, Visonomy, already had a platform that incorporated pretty extensive asset data based on open data and OpenStreetMap data. But we also worked directly with the cities to make sure the assets that they cared about most were incorporated. And so worked with them to incorporate additional GIS layers that we could then use to make sure we were getting at what they cared about. We then used this process to assess city assets to 6 climate hazards. And so for the climate exposure assessment that we did for each of the cities, we looked at floods and sea level rise, temperature and precipitation change, and then wildfires and landslides. And so for floods and sea level rise, we used FEMA firms for the 100 and 500 year floods. And then for sea level rise, we incorporated data that was developed as part of the Adapting to Rising Tides. And those are county specific projections that we incorporated. One of our objectives under this project was to use climate data that was as localized as possible. And so we overlaid that climate hazard data with asset data for each of the cities. And so you'll see that in that map to the left, what we've done is we have mapped both 36 inches of sea level rise, where the inundation is expected with that level of water. And then those icons represent different types of assets that are exposed to that particular hazard. I just want to note that in this particular graphic, there were so many hazards that were exposed that we weren't able to capture all of them in the image, but the cities also have access to the actual online platform, which allows them to go and look at this in more detail. But then also recognizing that we developed these tables to the right that capture what those different assets are, and also give cities a sense then of what the change in exposure is over time, and as water levels rise. For temperature and rainfall, we conducted in-house modeling to develop downscale projections at the city level for both temperatures and for rainfall. And what we did was we provided information on changes in average temperature as well as extremes to give the cities a better sense of what to expect in the future. For landslides and wildfire, landslides we use USGS data, and then for wildfires, data from the state's Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. And so similar to the work that we did regarding sea level rise, we overlaid the asset layers with the climate data layers to give cities a better sense of which particular assets were most at risk. And just to note that we were unable, these particular graphics don't necessarily capture those assets, but in the reports that we provided to the cities, we did do that. So based on the hazard assessment, we were asked to develop a set of adaptation measures that all of the participating cities could refer to inform their work. And so we did not necessarily develop location-specific adaptation measures, but a set that could serve as a useful reference or potential starting point for the cities. So for this process, we reviewed the relevant policy guidance, so things like the SB-379 draft guidelines, as well as FEMA requirements. We then reviewed what the cities had already done, acknowledging that, recognizing that the cities have already invested quite a bit of work in their local hazard mitigation plans and climate action plans, and in many cases already have actions that are relevant. And so we wanted to make sure we built on those. And then based on that identification of relevant actions, we conducted a gap analysis that would help us then figure out where we needed to fill gaps in terms of the categories of actions potentially, as well as specific types. And so based on this process, we developed a set of 20 to 25 recommended goals and actions. And then because we were trying to give the cities information that was actionable as possible, even as we were not developing location-specific adaptation actions, we incorporated information related to more practical considerations, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And so the adaptation measures were categorized by hazard. And then based on the gap analysis, we identified public health and emergency preparedness as 2 areas in which it would be useful to have actions that were specifically called out for them. And so what we've done is we have an overarching goal, which in this case is decreasing urban heat islands through more vegetation and tree planting. And then we provide a brief description, we highlight some of the hazards that this action can help to address, we indicate what some of the co-benefits are, as well as provide some sense of equity considerations. And then we provide individual actions under that overall goal that a city could potentially use to make some progress on moving towards that particular goal. And so the first action we've identified here is to assess what existing tree cover looks like. We highlight some of the key considerations and then provide a sense of whether or not we think this particular action would make sense or it's feasible in the short or the long term. Provide some sense of ease of implementation. So is it easy to implement? If it's easy to implement, then it's high. If it's low, if it's difficult to implement, then we rated it low. Provide some sense of who potential implementing partners are in the Alameda County context, as well as potential funding sources. And in terms of how cities are using this, I just wanted to give an example from Emeryville. So initially they had indicated they would be using this to inform their climate action plan. But once they had received the chapter, they, during the process of working with them, they indicated that they anticipated using the content to inform their next local hazard mitigation plan update, continued climate action plan updates, as well as their sea level rise plan, and helping to inform particular actions in the context of that sea level rise plan. They also indicated that they plan to use this to respond to relevant legislation. So there's SB-379, which relates to the State Lands Commission and lands that, public lands that local jurisdictions help manage. And then also to SB-379, which Michael, of course, provided some more context on earlier. And so for those of you who are interested, we have additional resources on our website. We have both a case study of the work in Alameda County, as well as we'll eventually have a series of 3 blog posts on climate hazard assessment and local adaptation planning. And the first of those is up, and that one is focused on the context for local adaptation planning. So if you have any follow-up questions, of course, always feel free to ping me, send me an email, and I will look forward to hearing from all of you.
Great, thank you so much, Yoon. We do have a number of questions, but we're gonna try to breeze through the additional resources and then we can loop back. So Kif, if you wanted to share a little bit about the fourth assessment project to kick us off.
Sure, and I can keep this quite brief. LGC and ICF International and Susan Mosier Research and Consulting have partnered up on one of the 4th climate assessment projects, looking at overcoming financial and institutional barriers to implementing local government adaptation strategies. It's really 2 projects in combination. We're well into the research projects and are starting to compile and distill our results. So I can't say a ton about the projects themselves, but a lot of what we're finding and seeing really reinforces the need for some of the resources we talked about, the structures that Michael talked about, the program that Nintara talked about, and certainly the work that Yoon is working on. I'll briefly say that the Financial Barriers Project is really looking at trying to understand what is the structure and the landscape of financial barriers, how large are the financing gaps, what are some feasible solutions, and what is the nature of the financing challenges. The slide that you can see right now is an example from the survey we did as part of this research that looked at some barriers to funding and rank ordering of the most common responses. And the thing I want to call out, which really speaks to a lot of what this whole session has been about, is the top 2 clusters. This first cluster that's highlighted now really looks at kind of the capacity to access funding, both whether you have enough funding or also whether you have the staff time and the costing knowledge to get at that funding or knowledge of where to go. This is really a capacity question as much as it is an availability of funding question. The second cluster that to me speaks to the structure of funding. Either you don't have the required matching funds, you can't integrate it into existing structures, or you don't meet requirements. These are two really important dimensions of funding that go beyond the actual scale of funding available. The second project that we're working on is looking at internal institutional structures. We are using a capability maturity model to explore the dynamics of local governments and how they might look at their design, their structure and operations to better align with the needs and responsibilities around climate adaptation. And what we've really sort of found through the research and what we're looking to develop into a toolkit, a roadmap, if you will, for local governments are what does it look like to be starting out on a certain dimension in your internal operations, and what does it look like to be fully optimized? And the four dimensions that we've distilled based on a number of workshops are staff capacity, leadership and organizational culture, institutionalized processes, and stakeholder engagement and partnership. And so from both of these projects over the next few months, some resources will be emerging, both specifically a toolkit and findings on the financial side that should be able to inform the state of play and some direction in how to go forward and tap into some of these other resources. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Julia.
Great, thanks, Jeff. I think we can breeze through this pretty quickly. I do want to at least get to a couple questions for Yoon. So if folks are interested in looking at adaptation-related legislation in the current session, we'll provide a link to ARCCA's 2017 tracking efforts. A number of the following bullet points here are a lot of the state resources and programs that are available. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Georgetown Climate Center Adaptation Clearinghouse and the NOAA Climate Resilience Toolkit. We recommend checking out those resources, as well as the National Adaptation Forum, which convenes annually. Will be coming up May 9th to 11th in St. Paul. There's also the California Adaptation Forum and the California Science Symposium, which will be held, which I believe are held either, I think the Adaptation Forum is held biannually, and then the symposium annually, and they'll both be held in 2018. So with that, and that was a quick brief through, Yoon, a couple of questions before we wrap up. Were the adaptation measures defined suggested by 427 or through co-creation with the cities?
They were, what we did was we built very much on what the cities already had in their existing plans. And so we reviewed all the participating jurisdictions, local hazard mitigation plans, relevant portions of their general plan, their climate action plan, and in some cases, additional relevant plans, and started there as a starting point to identify the actions that were the most relevant, and then went through a process of distilling them down to make that set more manageable, and then shared that kind of distilled list with the cities to give them an opportunity to comment on it. And so we weren't able to, gave the cities numerous opportunities to provide input. And so yes, we're able to obtain input from the different cities for this.
Wonderful. And how did you decide which data sets to use for the climate projections?
We were really focused on trying to provide data that was as localized as possible. And so that's why, for instance, we used what the Bay Area Commission for Development and Conservation had developed under the Adapting to Rising Tides project. So those sea level rise projections are the most localized ones that we could find. And that's also why we did the in-house modeling for temperature and precipitation to provide the cities with stuff that would be as relevant as possible.
Great, thanks so much.
This is Michael. Just to add on to that, and SB-379 certainly allows for customizing local data, particularly where local data is better or more appropriate to use for jurisdictions. So just to note that if you want to develop your own data, or you have a better resource for data that's not CalAdapt or one of the state-supported tools, then by all means do use it, but just provide a narrative for why you used it and why it is better than the base resource that we recommend.
Great, thanks, Michael. And thank you, Yoon and Nu and Tara as well. That is all the time that we have today. I do want to be mindful of everyone's time, and I'm sure everyone's really busy. We really appreciate everyone for joining us, and a special thanks to all of our panelists for making the time to join us today. As I mentioned, there were a lot of questions coming in. We'll be requesting that our panelists respond to them in a written format, and we'll be sharing that out with all of you. Again, the recording and the PowerPoints will also be available online. If you have any additional questions for our speakers and want to connect with them directly, you can see their contact information up on this slide here. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. We hope that you found this past hour valuable and informative, and hope that you'll join us for our next webinar, which I believe will be highlighting equitable adaptation strategies and practices. And that concludes this webinar. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.